Okay. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Welcome, welcome. We are at the last.
Thank you, everybody, for being here. Welcome, welcome.
Feedback.
At
There's feedback.
Little technical glitch.
Yeah.
Hello. Thank you. Sorry about that. We're here for our last session, and I'd like to welcome everyone. This has been an amazing 2 days full of outstanding presentations. I think all of us are feeling very full and warm and saturated with all of the great work we've heard, and not to quite end it yet, because here we are. I have the great pleasure of introducing and moderating this session with Beverly, Bain, and Idil Abdiliahi. I am Rosalind Hampton. I'm an educator and an activist from Montreal, and I work as a professor in the studies, social justice education in Black studies in the University of Toronto. My home is Montreal, Quebec, the territories of the Kanien'kehá:ka, and I live now here in Tikaranto in Toronto, the traditional territories of the Mississauga, of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, Chippewa, Haudenosaunee, and Wendat peoples. This is also land, of course, upon which and with Black peoples have lived for centuries through ongoing histories of enslavement, as well as forced and voluntary migrations. The wonderful speakers that I have the pleasure of convening with today are Beverly Bain, who is a Black queer feminist scholar activist who teaches in women and gender studies in the Department of Historical Studies at the University of Toronto, Mississauga. She currently teaches and researches in the area of Black queer feminist radical tradition, Black and Caribbean diasporic sexualities, gender feminism, and post-colonial theories, and gender violence and resistance. Beverly Bain is currently working on a series of essays on Black radical feminist queer activism in Toronto from the 1980s to the present, which is only testimony to how significant her work has been here in the city and for this country indeed. Idil Abdiliahi is a assistant professor in the School of Disability Studies at Ryerson University, and she is the co-author with Ronaldo Walcott of the book Black Life, Post-BLM, and the Struggle for Freedom. And so without further ado, I will jump into the questions. I'm going to ask the questions, and Beverly, I'm going to ask you to start with your response, and then Idil will follow, and then we'll kind of go from there and build our conversation. So the first question is, what does it mean for universities to invest in a militarized culture that increases the powers of campus police to arrest and handcuff on campus students in an emotional crisis?
Well, what it means is it's about criminalizing Black in particular and other racialized students. And I think that there's a little bit of context that needs to happen in terms of what has been happening. First, let me do sort of a political context of where we're at. To think about the extension of the carceral state at this political time, when we have witnessed, particularly this year, and continue to witness, this has been, it's been happening for decades now, but certainly has escalated at the, the nexus of the pandemic and and the current situation of the escalation of anti-Black police violence, of Black people, Indigenous people, racialized people in this country. What we have been seeing is that more powers have been given to police in general. Campus police has also been given more power. In fact, there's a certain kind of insidiousness that happens with campus police where they are somehow seen as benign, but in fact, they're not at all. They're seen as somehow performing community service and doing community work in the context of the safety, quote unquote, safety provisions, or the safety that they provide for the university. Well, campus police, in situations where a student, who have gone or who goes to the health service for support because they may be in crisis at that moment, are usually called in. In fact, that is policy. They're called in and they immediately say to the student, we have to arrest you and put you in handcuffs and take you off to the hospital. So we're seeing, put that in context with what's happening now. And let me be very clear, this happened last year. Thus, what it led to is myself and a couple other people deciding to do a campaign, including this with the support of the students. One student was handcuffed when this had happened to her. And she came and she wanted to know what to do about this because she felt this was just, you just don't handcuff somebody to go for help. And what it demonstrated that there was several other students who this had happened to, and this was a practice that was going on for a series, for a couple, at least 5 years, at least of what we know. And amongst those students were students of color and Black students. And in fact, Peel Police was also involved in certain situations, and in a particular case of a Black Somalian student who, because of her physique, she was seen as also threatening, but Black women in particular are seen as threatening. And when she refused to be handcuffed, and not refusal, but she was asking, why am I being handcuffed? And she resisted. She felt, well, I was not a threat. I just needed to go. I just needed help. They called the Peel Police, and she was literally pushed up against a cop car and shoved into the cruiser and taken off. So we see this sort of situation happening, and we're looking at what is happening on our television, and we're seeing the context that we're living in, where capital and capitalism has, has proliferated and proliferated in so extensively in society, and has shaped and continued to shape the institution in such a particularly insidious way. So to think about what is happening, and to think about the escalation, and to think about the expansion of surveillance in our university, what we are witnessing right now is that is an expansion of technology and surveillance within the university. We're seeing that as Ronaldo Walcott said, we're living in the belly of the surveillance beast, and there's no question that that is happening. That is happening everywhere in terms of what's happening with police. Just let's take police in general in terms of the Toronto Police Services Board, who instead of the Police Services Board and the city defunding the police, they have increased their budget by providing them with body cam. Are we to assume that body cameras will now be worn by campus police? They are already involved in increased surveillance of students. They are called when a student cheats or is accused of cheating on their test or exam, and the student is put in handcuffs and removed from the space. They're called in cases when students are in crisis. They put those students in handcuffs to take to the hospital. They're called in situations where there is a sense that what we are recognizing is a hyper-criminalization and a hyper sense of surveilling students. We know of situations where students have actually argued and have complained, that they are and have been surveilled. They've been stopped and asked for ID. When white students are not asked for ID. We saw what happened out west when the campus police came in and dragged this woman right through the corridor outside, an Asian student. So we see the practice of campus police. So campus police is not benign. Campus police, they are constables that have been designated to operate on the university, but they're operating within the same kind of frame as policing, and as policing outside in the larger sphere. In fact, their directives come from the Toronto Police Services Board and Peel Police. So any changes and shifts that happens at the level of the police force actually does shape and further shape their practices. They may tell you they're accountable to the university, but they're actually accountable to the police services. So here is what we're faced with in terms of the impact for students and the impact for faculty in this context. Last year in October, we actually started this campaign where we sent a letter out. About over 100 scholars signed on, saying that they were appalled that students were being surveilled and students were being put in handcuffs, and didn't realize that this was happening. Again, we don't have this information. We don't know that this is happening on a regular basis. In fact, white faculty will not know this is happening. Black and brown faculty may have experienced some of this. Brown and black and racialized students may have experienced some of this, but overall, we are not supposed to know that this is policy, when in fact it is policy. And we created this campaign. It became, it became very public. The media picked it up. It became a conversation in terms of, at the same time, students, there were issues of suicide on campus, issues of mental health, crises that happened where suicides were taking place. Students had created their own committees to deal with mental health issues. They challenged the university in terms of the fact that the university is not creating safety for them, or providing a safety, or providing a way for them to be safe within the university without having to actually be criminalized at the same time. So, I mean, we're seeing all of this happening all at the same time, and the university denying that they are not actually handcuffing students, that they're not doing any of those things, and that that police are trained and that they're trained to de-escalate, and they're using all of this language which actually is very much the language that we see gets used in the larger sphere, in terms of by the Toronto Police Services Board and by other bureaucrats and by the Toronto Police Services themselves, that they are trained to do all of this. When in fact, the reality of the matter is that the extension of the carceral state means that students, means that faculty, particularly those of us who are Black, racialized, and Indigenous, are at risk in terms of this particular climate. The fact that we actually organized the scholars' strike very much is about engaging what is happening in the larger context. The fact that more Black people are dying at the hands of police, more Indigenous people are dying at the hands of police, the fact that police brutality has escalated, the fact that funding has been increased for policing and for militarization, the reality that we are moved into a particular period here in the pandemic within the institution. And I mean, Ronaldo made a really good argument here and pointed to the fact that we are actually, the fact that we are all going online in this particular context. What does it mean in this context where there's hyper surveillance of Black bodies, of Indigenous bodies, of racialized bodies in this environment? What does it mean for us to extend the surveillance state within the university? And mind you, the university has always been a carceral state. Let us not ever forget that. But there is an extension, and there is a certain kind of subterfuge happening, because things are being fused in such a way that it's become so diffused or so diffused in such particular kinds of way that it may seem somehow benign because it's not recognizable. Like all of these particular kinds of surveillance techniques and these kinds of functioning is not recognizable to us because it's so diffuse, and technology does that. Technology does that. Technology is manipulative in a way to ensure that we can't see what's happening. Our students are being trained to surveil each other, right? I mean, we talk about surveillance, which is what we do with our cameras when we turn it on the state and we turn it on the police. But our students are actually surveilling. They're being trained to surveil, to keep other students in line, to keep other people in line, to keep professors in line, right? They're also doing that as part and parcel of the work of the institution, of the university. So here we have an institution at this particular time that actually is dependent and reliant on more technology and more surveillance in terms of its teaching. We also have, at this particular time, we have universities who are saying we need more campus police. We need to have more of this, we need to have more aspects of safety. I looked at the budget and I looked at their report in terms of what are some of the complaints that police on campus received and what they responded to. What was interesting is that in addition to responding to theft, which is the highest, okay, but the reality of the matter is, students are poor. Right? I'm not trying to, but they respond to theft most. Most of it is, or secondly, they respond to a suspicious person on campus, whatever suspicious means. And then the third category was they respond to students in crisis. In all of this situation, it is about criminalization of students. So they're actually responding to students in crisis within a context of where those students are now being criminalized. They're now being arrested for actually saying that the stress and pressures of the institution that I am exposed to within this environment is having an impact on me, and I need support from you. And then you say, well, I'm sorry, but this is all I can do, but we need to call in the campus police so that they can take you to the hospital. And then the campus police appears and they say, we have to take you into custody. And you ask why, and they say, we have to put you in handcuffs. Why? Because you may attack us, and it's for your safety. I'm thinking, and the students are thinking, well, but we're not doing anything. We're not trying to run away. If we didn't want to go to the hospital, if we didn't want to be taken to the hospital or to be supported, we wouldn't come here in the first place. So why do you think you need to put me in handcuffs and restrain me to take me to a place that I have no problems going because I'm looking for support?
Yes.
Right? So again, this is also part and parcel of the carceral logic of the state. I mean, and which is penetrated the university, and the university is, an extension of the state and its processes, and the extension of capitalism. And I mean, and as professors in the university, I mean, I think the question that Ronaldo posed, and I think Ronaldo has provided us a very good segue, so I'm going to pull out from a number of the things he has said because I think it makes sense. What are we willing to risk, right, at this point in not holding the university to account? What are we willing to do to make them accountable, right? So, Rosalind, you're one of the people on this campaign with Vanina Steinbach, who we have recently drafted this letter. Again, this is the second letter that went to the president, detailing our demands, indicating that we do not want campus police on campus, and a number of other demands that we made. And we got back a letter from the vice, I think it's the vice president of Equity and Human Resources, Kellyanne Moffat, basically saying that they are working with the police around all of these issues. They're looking at anti-racism and anti-racism training and, training so that police can be more sensitive in dealing with, those who are in crisis. Thank you for your letter. Nowhere in our demands did we ask for anti-racism training. Nowhere did we ask for any kind of training. What we clearly demanded was defunding, right? Was defunding and removal of campus police, to begin that process of demanding and removing campus police from the university. If we don't insist on removal of campus police from the university, we are also participating in the contribution and the extension and the expansion of the carceral state, because we are expected to do the jobs of the university. We are expected to call police on our students, right? It is what we are expected. We are expected to call police on our students when they ask for help, right? This is an expectation based on the fact that it is the job that they do. I'm going to stop there because we're going to have more conversations.
Absolutely.
I want to give Idil a chance to, and we're going to continue to talk more.
Great. So Idil, the question was, what does it mean for universities to be investing in a militarized culture and increasing the powers of campus police to arrest and handcuff students? One of the things that I'm thinking is that Bev has given us such a phenomenal, comprehensive kind of answer to that. If you also want to maybe speak to specifically about thinking about like the kind of virulently patriarchal culture of the university and the ways in which these dynamics around campus policing actually play out along lines of race and racialization as well as gender. And so specifically around how Black, Indigenous, and Indigenous women in particular are disciplined through campus policing. So kind of anywhere in that broad range of discussion, you can jump in.
Thank you, Rosalind. Bev, I can listen to you talk all day, so thank you. In terms of the question, I think one of the key things first let me build on this. I think one of the first things that we need to do is stop thinking about the campus and the university as precious, special, or unique. And by that, I mean that if we understand the social world as operating outside of the academy and outside of the institution, then we must begin to understand the ways in which the campus absolutely is embedded in the institution. So when I think about that, I think about the ways in which U of T is embedded in the downtown core of Toronto, Takaranto here. I think about the ways in which Ryerson University is embedded in the downtown core. I think about the ways in which York is certainly embedded in and around the Jane and Finch community, and what that means. So first, I think that whatever issues happen outside of the university campus, we must understand that they certainly will play out within the campus and within the university context. And so therefore, the campus is not unique regarding the experiences of over-policing, regarding the experiences of surveillance, et cetera, et cetera. And obviously, I don't need to say this, we've had 2 days of impeccable scholars, community and student participants commenting in the comments that have talked about that we are on stolen lands. So what does it mean then to have campuses and communities on stolen land, whereby then we create a different tier of expectation on campuses? Because for whatever reason, well, not whatever reason, if we look at the Canadian historical context, we see that education has been fraught for racialized people, Indigenous people, and Black people. We see that in many ways more than one, beyond sort of the current and contemporary conservative and neoconservative conversations around education, that within the histories, we see the ways in which Asian and South Asian communities have been segregated out of education. We see the ways in which Black and Indigenous people have been segregated and removed out of education, disciplined out of education. When I talk about education, I want to be clear that often we want to make a distinction between sort of tertiary, medication time. We often want to make a difference between, tertiary, sort of high school education, university, so forth. And ultimately, I think that what we need to think about, how we need to think about the education system is in the context of a continuum. So if in the 6th grade, and I remember actually talking about this at my job talk when I got hired for my job at Ryerson University, talking about the context of containment, carceralities, and confinement. And I talked about what happens when a 6-year-old is contained in the classroom. So often, and particularly within the American context, we talk about sort of the school to prison pipeline. And here in Canada, and likely in the United States and across the Americas, what we know is that there isn't at this point a school to prison pipeline. Rather, the classroom is the prison in very many ways. And when I say the prison, I'm talking about it as a space of containment and not in the context of prison in, the folks I work with that are in provincial and federal kinds of prisons. But when a 6-year-old can be handcuffed in her classroom, et cetera, and we see those experiences throughout junior school, middle school, and high school, why would we not assume that there's ways in which discipline and carcerality and containment play out in the university? And outside of race, I think that one of the things that I want us to think about, I've jumped all over the place. Okay, let me go back. Okay, that means slow down. Okay, I will. So sort of just going back to the idea of the way we understand the campus is, if we already know that there's a legacy and a history of the ways in which Black, Indigenous, and racialized people have been both contained, surveilled, and harassed and removed out of education. And when I talk about that, I also obviously, Black, Indigenous, and racialized people are also people living with disabilities. And so I also, when I talk about that, I really want to be clear that I'm talking about mad people, queer people, trans people, people living with disabilities, neurodivergent people, people that are deaf and otherwise. These are the communities I'm talking about, because I'm also fairly exhausted of having to be clear that I'm speaking of intersections when I speak of these communities. So if we know that all of these communities that I've identified already are pushed out of the education system, why do we think that in the context of university that this would not happen in the same way? So I think, for example, about the ways in which students who deface public property are disciplined. I think about the ways in which students who don't fit into sort of dominant ways of learning and thinking are also sort of removed from the classroom, the ways in which colleagues speak about the ways in which students that live with disabilities, sort of unbelong. And ultimately, sort of, I began earlier by talking about where institutions are located. And earlier, my colleague, Dr. Ronaldo Walcott, spoke about our other good colleague and friend, Jamie Magnuson, who talks about the sort of holdings and the ways in which finances are moved throughout institutions. And for me, some of the work that I do and what I think about are the ways in which, as universities buy more property, so as I watch U of T and Ryerson and York buy more property, what does that mean in the context then of needing to protect that property, right? And what does that look like? So when we think about one of the largest sort of financial benefits of universities is that universities are consistently expanding. So I think about my university and sort of where my university was located before, and the way in which my university has expanded, and therefore the ways in which my university now also needs to protect this space that it's expanded on. And what that then means is that the people who live in and around the institution that I teach at, and I'm very thankful because the department that I teach in, the School of Disability Studies, particularly the Faculty of Community and Social Services, is located within a really unique neighborhood in Toronto. And that neighborhood is one that is surrounded by most of the shelters, safe injection sites, parole, probation, ODSP, housing drop-in centers, and soup kitchens. So going to work every day for me reminds me of the work that I'm doing. And so what I want to think about is, how do institutions think about themselves in the context of community? So what has my institution done? What has York done to think about Black people in the Jane Finch community, to think about the ways in which Black people have been policed within the Jane Finch community, to think about the ways in which Black, Indigenous, working class, poor, and disabled people don't have access to going to university, but we certainly want to police these communities to ensure that they don't disrupt our faculty and our students, and the ways in which my institution, and like I said, for myself, I am so thankful that I get to see the reality of the things that I teach every day when I walk to work, whether that is walking through Moss Park, whether that is walking directly in front of my building. That is a reminder that I make a living, and I tell my students this, I make a living because these are the folks that I walk by. And so what does it mean when my institution doesn't want those people in and around the place that I teach, using our bathrooms, using our facilities, coming and asking for change, smoking a cigarette in the building where I work? What does that mean? And I have to think about that in the context of property, belonging and unbelonging, and the kinds of undesirable behaviors that institutions are seeking to police. And then I think about the ways, or the ways that as academics, right? And as people who are supposed to be sort of at the vanguard of thinking and being cutting edge, the ways in which we actively refuse to think with and alongside the communities and people and organizations that our institutions are embedded in. I also think a lot about the ways in which, like, my being at work does not make me precious or special, in that when I don't have my ID, which I often need more than my Ryerson faculty ID, I also often need my driver's license to prove that I'm me. But I think about the ways in which then the institution decides to make me spectacular and precious and worry about protecting me, but not about the people who are exactly like me, but may not have the benefit and privileges that I have for being in the very institution that is saying that they don't want those folks in that space. So I think about that. I think about the ways in which, and the ways that I'm implicated in the academy, sort of reproducing a particular kind of middle class people that also need to be protected from the very people that we are talking about and engaging with. And I hold that alongside, and I want to be really clear, I hold that alongside being a Black woman who has been harassed on campus. I hold that alongside knowing that I have Indigenous colleagues who've also been harassed on campus. I hold that alongside understanding histories of students, particularly women, queer folks, men and otherwise, trans folks, non-binary folks who've experienced violence on campus, who also require a response. What I'm saying is, as we think about sort of quote unquote imagining different ways, I want to remind us that while we are trying to imagine, that many of us are living in the present. And that while we want to imagine and sort of think about notions of futurity, that we must sort of forge and fight for our freedoms today. And so what does it mean right now and today for us to really think about doing the work that it means to change the conditions of, you know, students living with disabilities, racialized students, MAD students, Indigenous students, Black students, queer, trans, non-binary students. What does that mean, right? What does it mean when campus security finds a student who's self-harming in their first year, on-campus residence, and the student is upset because, you know, they've developed some kind of safety plan and they know that maybe they have their therapist access, they have all these things that they need. However, campus security, because a roommate or someone else is like, wow, well, I'm really afraid of this person. And I think that they're gonna, you know, really harm themselves, call security. And that person says, well, no, I'm okay. And, you know, is understood as resisting, and then therefore gets evicted from their their housing in the university, gets a charge for for assaulting police officers, has no support, is here living by themselves from like buttfuck nowhere, Ontario. And again, this isn't about race. This is also about care, refusing carceral cares, being there for students. What does that response mean for that student, and how do we honor the dignity of that student? So I feel like I've been talking for a long time, but ultimately the invitation that I'm offering today is for us to really think closely and alongside the ideas of property, campus, ideas of orderly and disorderliness, ideas of social order, and the ways that we're asked to exercise that outside of community, within community, and then the ways that we're asked to sort of tell on each other and snitch on each other, right? So I know that there are policies across campuses throughout Ontario that talk about, you know, if you think your colleague comes to work and they're disheveled or disorganized, you know, you should really talk to someone about that. If you're worried about your student, sort of to disclose that information. And ultimately, many of us don't go to work to be an op. And so, you know, that's not what we signed up for. And so without challenging broader ideas of policing and surveillance within the campus, what does it then mean about what you are conceding to, you know, without anybody knowing, which is that you are also going to engage in this, because this is ultimately part of the really small print in policy that people don't read. And I also really appreciate some of the scholars earlier who talked about, like, you're not going to find some of the most critical scholars or the sort of interesting work, not that person said that, but that we need to think about places like policy studies, of which that is where my PhD comes from, the close reading, the unsexy reading, the in-depth reading, the reading that is both discursive, figurative, literal in many ways, and what makes how sort of these policy scripts are end up living on and being inscribed and practiced on Black, Indigenous, racialized, non-binary, queer, disabled, otherwise differently abled people.
Wonderful.
So important, and so many big points. And I think like what you've both said just works so well together in terms of, Bev, you kind of raising this key point about the police and campus police in particular at the universities not being a benign force that we so often assume, or, you know, people so often assume that it is actually not a big deal and it's okay and they just kind of do nice things. And certainly what we know is that the institution of policing is intended for all of these things that we're talking about. And it'll, to really raise that issue, kind of illustrates what you were saying, Bev, about the fact that the calls from the UT campus police so often are about protecting the property. And that when we're expanding the property of Ryerson, or we're expanding the property of UT or any university, that we're expanding that reach into and to control, you know, the community and the local folks around us as well. And we certainly saw a lot of that in the battle to kind of prevent the special constables from coming in to Ryerson and the ways in which Ryerson, as Idil has so importantly pointed out, is situated in a particular location that is very contested space still. And that in order for the university to function in a certain way, it was really trying to kind of hold its space and kind of barricade its space and surveil its space. I wonder, Bev, picking up on that, if you would speak a little more to the current call to abolish policing, to defund campus police and to abolish campus policing, and what that looks like. You know, what does that mean in relation to some of the reasons that we're making that call? We know that CAMH has also issued a statement, right? So like the mental health professionals themselves, although as Elle has reminded us, are also implicated in the policing function,
exactly,
trying to distinguish themselves at the same time from the, you know, municipal police who intervening in mental health crisis. So I'd like for you to speak a little more about that in relation to the university and why, given all of this that we're talking about in relation to their function, that the senior administration is then kind of not responding to these calls and not addressing explicitly and directly the calls to defund and abolish campus police.
Yeah, I think one of the things, I think in terms of talking about the actual defunding and abolishing is that, listen, there is a larger call. And, you know, Idil made this point. We cannot think of the university as separate from larger society. And I think I said that earlier as well. The university is an extension of the larger society. We are calling for abolishing police and policing in general because of the, you know, the rootlessness of policing as an institution, which is designed, and we heard this morning, was critically designed for the purposes of surveilling, for regulating, for to do violence upon the bodies of Black and Indigenous people in this country, and also racialized people. I mean, that is so evident. In terms of the campus and in terms of abolishing police on campus, very much, if we are seeing that the police is an extension with very similar kinds of powers and different ways in which that power can be manipulated, and in ways more insidiously because they are presented as benign, then we are definitely wanting to see that particular force removed from the university. We have to reimagine what safety is, and this is a larger conversation we've been having throughout, is that we have to reimagine what safety is. There's ways to create safety on campus that does not involve campus police. And if, as we're saying, as Idil said earlier on, about the importance of property, which it is, you know, I mean, this is why campus police is there. They're not there to protect students and faculty. They're there to protect property. The reason why they put students in handcuff is because of liability, to avoid liability issues, right? They're afraid of being sued. Okay. So there are all of these things, and it's all about protecting the institution, not about the lives necessarily of the students and of the professors in terms of what we understand as safety. We don't need campus police to keep us safe. We can create our own processes of safety and our own mechanism of safety. Students are very dynamic and creative. Students are very smart. I mean, they use the knowledge that they're given to actually figure out, you know, how, you know, to take care of themselves. We can create committees with students and with faculty and with staff, you know, to create safety communities on campus. I mean, there were days, I mean, if we go back to the women's community and if we go back to the anti-violence community, you know, there was a period in history before sexual assault became that which was conscripted to the criminal code, where you know, women, where we found ways to support women and walk with women to provide safety measures for women so that they can be safe, right, without having police intervention, because there's always been this, you know, challenges of policing within policing communities around the issue of domestic violence and sexual assault. So in the earlier period, we found ways in which to create supports and safety mechanisms for women without having to involve police. Now we no longer can do that. The police is the front line of every intervention that has to do with our lives. And the police institution is a criminal and criminalized institution and a carceral institution. It is not designed, to so-called provide care, right? The kind of care that would ensure that, Black lives, racialized lives, Indigenous lives remain safe. It exists only, to criminalize. And its mechanism is all about doing such. So therefore, it is critical that we start reimagining this whole issue of safety and mechanisms of safety on campus, which can be, can be done, is that we can create safety committees made up of individuals on campus, students, professors, staff. We can create those kinds of mechanisms, and the university, instead of paying for campus police, should put money into creating those safety committees on campus.
Idil, do you want to add anything about that, particularly around how we respond? Because I think, so Bev has started to kind of touch on like what other alternatives there are. One of the things that we hear a lot when we're doing this kind of work is like, but what if? And certainly it's not like, we've already kind of established that what the police are doing is not like intervening in the kinds of situations that people often assume we need police for. I'm wondering if you want to speak a little bit more to the idea that something we've heard a lot in talking about abolition is, like, in relation to campus policing, is what are we to do in our classrooms if we have a disruption, or if we have a student issuing threats to us, or if we are feeling unsafe as professors and feeling as though we're unable to keep our students safe. And I'm purposely using that provocative use of the word safe that I rarely do in order to try and kind of draw out the narratives that people so often are concerned about, and with good reason, right? We all know, as being racialized professors and doing the kinds of work that we do, that it's very possible that you're going to have somebody taking your course who is expected to have that kind of relationship with you as your student that ends up really meaning you harm. And I've certainly heard from colleagues this concern. So I'd love to hear you, Idil, if you would comment on that. And then maybe Bev, you too can comment on that specifically, because I think those are both that's a huge issue for a lot of people. And so I'd really love to hear both of you on that.
Okay.
So Bev, did you want to go first, or?
No, you go first.
Thank you. So I guess, first of all, I'd like to challenge the idea that the person living with mental health issues, the person needing to be apprehended by police, the person who doesn't belong in the academy is always the student. It is not always only the student. And I think that we need to challenge these distinctions. The person who's living with a disability, the person that is racialized, the person that is queer, trans, non-binary, Indigenous, Black, racialized, this is also the professor. This is also your colleague. The person calling the police on you is your colleague. The person calling HR on you is your colleague. The person calling the union on you is your colleague. So it's really important that I think we also, we hold that there are particular kind of distinctions that we make, that it is the students only who experience these issues, and that is professors sort of are the only sort of site of discipline for students, but rather that we are these very people, right? And I think often what happens, particularly for those of us who have the luxury of privilege from a distance, really talk about, we forget that when we came in the academy, maybe we were cleaning a hospital toilet, right? We forget that maybe when we started in the academy, we were working relief at a shelter, right? And we were also disbelonged there in particular kinds of ways, that we were the mad, that we were the disabled, that we were the disenfranchised, that we were the underemployed and the unemployed. Neoliberalism and neoliberal logics ensures that at some point we may be these people. And so what happens when our colleagues forget that they too are us and we are them, right? And neither of us are more precious than the other, but that white supremacy certainly indicates that we should be. We should be snitches and sellout demons and devils, okay? And these are things that we need to hold. So I'm not invested in the conversation that is only about the student. I'm invested in the conversation about us, as also as faculty, as staff, as those who support our work, right? Now, in the context of students, again, our students are homeless. Our students are living with addiction. Our students are mad. Our students are Black, they're Indigenous, they're queer, they're racialized. And in particular now, quote, post-COVID, we are going to get a different kind of student, both in our online classroom as well as in our classrooms, if and when we go back to that classroom. And I think that we need to consider that and think of that really, really, really seriously. And to that end, part of what you asked, Rosalind, if I'm not mistaken, is what happens when a student experiences this in the classroom, right? And I guess my question is, why again do we want to spectacularize and make precious the classroom? Is the classroom yet again not a space in which is a public space, right? Is a space in which life is expected to happen there. If the expectation is that I'm teaching critically about life and what happens in life, am I not to expect that racism, trauma, sexism, homophobia also takes place there? And then am I not to sort of think about what the working through of that will be? And of course, that lands on me differently as a Black woman, as an untenured woman, in terms of the risks and challenges that I take. But what else am I there for if not that, right? And of course, I think, I know earlier I'd commented in Professor Walcott and Professor Palmer's discussions around what it means to be a pre-tenure faculty and the ways in which discipline, silence, social order is played out on you has an impact, and that impact is also on our students. And so the lack of an intervention, the need to contact campus security if somebody, immediately kind of disagrees, et cetera, or the need to call 911 from my cell phone in the classroom. These are things that we need to talk about. But I also think that it is above and beyond talking about it in the context of individual professors' classrooms, but also talking about the ways in which administration and faculty, and particularly faculty with power, deal with these things, and then the ways in which administration makes sort of unwritten policy scripts about what is acceptable and not acceptable, right? And so then when the untenured Black, mad, queer, racialized faculty member, Indigenous faculty member decides to do something differently, the way that then becomes absolutely outside of the norm and requiring a different kind of discipline for doing something different. And so I think about that. And also ultimately think about the ways in which Indigenous students with disabilities, Black students in particular, queer, non-binary students, are constantly experiencing crisis. And when I say students, I'm saying faculty, right? Are constantly experiencing violences. I know earlier one of the professors and scholars talked about being in a belly of surveillance and the university being an extreme space of violence. And so the idea that sort of violence stops and starts at some point is also problematic. And again, I also want to turn our attention and our gaze on spaces that we have inherently expected to be critical spaces, right? Social justice departments, women's studies departments, social work departments, all of these kinds of liberal democratic departments that really benefit off of the radical work while disciplining, abusing, harassing scholars, right? And I also want to nuance another piece. I know earlier, Dr. Andrea A. Davis did an impeccable and beautiful presentation on the experiences of Black women in the academy. And I also want to invite us to think about the ways in which Blackness is Blackness. Okay, so whether or not I am a Black woman, a Black man, a Black queer man, a Black trans person, a Black person living with a disability, what I want us to think about ultimately is that in all of these tropes, there are discourses. So if I'm a Black woman, I'm arrogant, I'm rude, I'm disrespectful. If I'm a Black gay man, I'm catty, and right? There are all these kinds of discourses that are also still connected to ideas of race and gender in ways that are really problematic, right? If I'm a Black person who's living with a disability, if I'm a Black person who's Muslim, if I'm Indigenous to spirit, if I'm all these identities, I'm not going to speak for Indigenous peoples, particularly Indigenous peoples to Turtle Island, but I am going to speak from what I've witnessed, lived through, and seen, and that is that when it comes to the idea of Blackness, I don't want to create a hierarchy. I want to speak to specificity and nuance, layer, and texture, but I also want to hold the ways in which my Black gay colleagues, gay male colleagues, gay cis male colleagues, my Black non-binary colleagues, my Black colleagues living with a disability, visible or non-visible, also experience particular kinds of, to be colloquial, licks or oppression. And I think that we need to hold this. I think about quite early on in my dissertation career, hearing from someone on my supervisory committee who was a Black man that a white colleague slapped him on the arm in the middle of a faculty meeting. And I had gone to meet with this person, and they essentially told me that was supposed to be some kind of training ground for what it means to be in the academy. I think about my Black male queer colleagues who are deemed dangerous in their department, who are silenced in their department, who face both homophobia, a particular kind of dangerousness around being a Black man. I think about my Black women colleagues, of course, who are always seen as rude and disrespectful and audacious and out of order. I think about my colleagues who are living with disabilities that are fearful to disclose that they may be living with a disability because they want to not rock the boat, quote unquote, right? And so these are complex kinds of things. And I think that there are ways in which obviously Blackness and particular kinds of Blackness acquiesces to whiteness, but there are ways in which some of our Blackness never and has always refused to acquiesce to whiteness. And I think that we need to hold these complexities. And I think that in particular, as we think together today as Black scholars, I think about all of the Black scholars. I'm thinking, I'm not going to sit here and name names, but I'm thinking of all the Black scholars who taught me, whether it's through arts, visual culture, social science, humanities, that have taught me to really complicate the ways in which we understand Blackness as a marker, right? And so when we begin to parse that out, what does that mean? What does that look like? What is the impact of that, right? I always want to hold, you know, my potential Black colleague who wears a hijab, who may be living with a disability, who may be lighter. I want to hold that narrative. I want to hold my Black queer male, cis male colleagues' narrative, because I know that Blackness is a marker, right? And I begin there in many ways, and obviously the ways in which we make our colleagues, the ways in which we make our colleagues unsafe. And when I say we, I'm talking about white people, non-Black people, right? Like, I'm not talking about Black people. I'm talking about Black people in many ways. I'm also talking about racialized colleagues, right? And the ways that colleagues give up on us. Refuse, deny, right? Raz, I'm done.
Bev, do you want to chime in there? I have a couple.
What I'd like to say, I want to go back to the piece on, your question regarding, complaints, that colleagues say sometimes what happens in a case where a student comes forward or they feel threatened by a student. It's quite interesting because the reality of the matter is that I think we have been so regularized in a particular way to rely only on a particular kind of way to engage. And it has to be based on a kind of policing, punitive kind of approach. There are aggressive students. I have faced aggressive students as a Black professor in classrooms, particularly. I've taught in schools that are at universities that have been just only white students, and I have faced some aggression. But it has never occurred to me to actually immediately deal with this student by deciding that I would bring security in, or go to that particular place. I do think that there is something to be said about who those students are, who the professors are that are actually complaining about lack of safety. Because in so many instances, the situation is that usually what happens in a lot of cases, and I've heard of stories where, the students who are more or less pointed out as threatening are usually students of color. And the professors are usually those who are white. And in fact, the issues have always, in terms of how Black professors and racialized professors and Indigenous professors are located in the university. And particularly if you are Black and you're queer and you're very open about your queerness and your Blackness in a particular kind of way, that actually you are seen as the threat. So I think we come back to this focus on, can we then decarceral or decarceralize the institution and our own way of how we understand, negotiations and dealing with each other? Does it always have to be about immediately going to that place of, calling security? I mean, it's an easy thing to do. It's the same thing with police. You call them and you said that someone's in crisis, and you call them and in 10 seconds, the person is dead, because no one wants to engage or to attempt to have a conversation with someone, or to, in the context of situations like this, or to figure out other kinds of mechanisms and ways to establish yourself in the classroom and to also establish a certain kind of relationship with your students, right? I think there is we tend to immediately zoom in onto a kind of punitive, kind of carceral approach in how we deal with each other. And I mean, Idil was correct when she says it happens also with our own colleagues, where I've experienced this myself, where rather than colleagues engaging with you because of differences in terms of your politics or your positions, that immediately it becomes something where they feel they can go to the policy, immediately use that as a way to whip you into line. So we too have learned this sort of, approach to regulate and to silence each other. And it happens particularly with white faculty in relation to Black faculty. And it happens particularly, in relation to, Black women who tend to feel the brunt of this even more, or tend to be positioned as more threatening in the classroom, as well as in relationship with each other. So it is critical that we start figuring out how we engage with policies that doesn't always move towards some kind of punitive carceral approach to dealing with things as they arise in the institution between students and faculty. That there has to be other kinds of alternatives, of intervention, right? That allow us, we have to think about creating we have to think of creating another way to be human within the world, and therefore we have to recreate another way to be human in the institution. The institution produces us in such robotic, such controlled and regulated modes that we no longer are allowed to think critically and collectively and creatively about particular kinds of approaches to how we engage with each other. It's always about, here's the policy, let's use it. Let's immediately go after this person using this. Let's immediately the student seems and feels threatening, let's call security, right? These are the kinds of approaches that are taken. And I think if we start rethinking and recreating the university in a different way, and I just want to say something that Ronaldo says that I think was critical. This is what we should be doing right now in this particular climate, rather than creating and forcing everyone to go on to Zoom and online teaching and learning. This should be an opportunity where we continue to have the kinds of learning and sessions that are very much facilitated across the board in ways like we are having these teach-ins, where people can start engaging in particular kinds of ways with each other, students and professors, where the learning becomes more reciprocal, and where it becomes more expansive. So, I'll stop there, but this is something for us to think about, because I am interested in the recreation of what exists today. I'm not interested in continuing to live in this particular enclosed, regulated, surveilled spaces that we continue to keep reproducing.
But what were we living in before?
Huh?
Bev, what were we living in before, Bev?
No, you're right. I'm saying I'm not willing to continue to do that.
Okay, I support it. Me either.
That's my point. I'm not interested in continuing to live in those kinds of spaces anymore. This is why we need to kind of think about, what comes next. Mm-hmm. Because, and this is what is critical about, what are we willing to do to make, to shift this? Mm. What risk are we willing to take to shift it, right? And I think this is the question that we need to think about, because we have been living in it for too long, and it's only becoming incredibly more punitive and much more, far more vociferous than it is, particularly now. So if we don't find a way to shift that, to shift the university, to confront its regulatory processes, and its surveillance processes and its ongoing, which acts on us as Black, racialized, and Indigenous people as violent, which we experience as violent. If we don't intervene, we continue, we're continuing to bear this in such a devastating way.
Mm-hmm.
So the risk, I think we have to consider that we have nothing to lose at this point, only to gain. Should we, we have nothing left to lose.
Yeah, I think some of the points I just really want to kind of like think with you and kind of underscore some of the points that the two of you have just made, because I just think they're so crucial and they really do direct us towards that futurity that we're talking about, right? That we can kind of think about orienting ourselves away from this and take concrete steps to do so. And one of the things, Idil, I just got so strongly from what you were saying is that, and both of you actually, because part of what you're talking about is the ways in which the structure of the institution socializes us into thinking in relation to a normalized violence and normalized fear and a normalized external dominating force that controls all that, and that we ourselves also are supposed to be kind of scripted into that force in our own kind of way, at our own kind of level. And when the supposed threat surpasses that, then we're to resort to the external force. And what I just loved so much about what you said, Idil, is that like once you start challenging that premise that the university is exceptional in any way, or that the classroom space is exceptional in any way, then all of that falls to pieces.
Exactly.
Right. And so like, why would we expect for the university classroom to be any safer than any other space? Exactly. Right. And this idea of then refusing to other students, I think really calls on a certain politic that undermines that notion that somehow, professors are like, something else, and that students are something else. And like when we do that assumption, then there's like an othering of the students in relation to ourselves, right? They're them, we're us. And I think like part of what you're calling on us to do, Idil, is to work with our students, in community with our students and our colleagues and the staff, but not to see our students as some other force that comes in and like we have to deal with, right? Exactly. But that like we're in community with them. And so when we're in classroom with them, then that means that like we're also responsible collectively for creating an environment in which nobody decides to call the cops. Exactly. Right. And that no matter, and that we have some kinds of processes and have difficult conversations about like under what circumstances will we do what things. And to have those conversations means to not know in advance what the outcome of those conversations are. Mm-hmm. And I guess for me, one of the things that really does is call on us to like the kinds of risks that we're supposed to take, right? Like as we're talking about like risk taking and about being willing to take those risks. Mm-hmm. I think that a culture of fear and violence in any institution makes us very afraid to take those risks, right? And so like we want to just appear like we've got it, we're in control and we have it all under, and it's all very clear and straightforward. And, and like to have those messy conversations with our students is to expose ourselves as not being that thing that professors get constructed as, right? Exactly. So I really, for the last kind of couple of questions that I would love, or the last couple of comments I'd love to hear you kind of respond to, is to kind of look moving forward. And as we're moving into this new semester, and thinking about all of these things and holding seriously, I think, as we all are, what our colleague Ronaldo Walcott said earlier about the opportunity that has been provided, that we have, missed in the spring. And, as academia will do, if we don't do something different, we'll just keep missing it, right? And so, like, instead of that, how we move into the fall thinking otherwise about this. And I would love to hear both of you kind of comment in concrete ways, especially for, teachers and learners who are listening, the kind of pedagogical imperative, right? Of like, we're all galvanized after this, last couple of days, we've been talking a lot about doing things without police involved, in doing things without anti-Black violence, and confronting colonialism as it is embedded in these institutions and in our own minds as we move forward. If you could speak a bit as professors to the pedagogical imperatives of the scholar oriented towards abolition, of the activist scholar who has not entered the academy to reproduce this or to gain a particular sense of authority that can only be reinforcing of the institution itself. I'd love for us to end kind of moving in that direction. Yeah. Whoever wants to go, jump in.
Go ahead, Idil.
No.
Oh, you're not. You're not going there?
No, you've been in this game longer than I do.
No,
no, absolutely not.
Here's where what I'll say. I'll say that I think doing the scholar strike has shifted a lot for me, and I'll say why. It has, in the sense that what it has really brought front and center, based on all of the work that we've seen happen over the 2 days, in terms of all of the presentations, all of the teachings, all of the conversations that have taken place. I mean, what has become very clear is that what we have moved into is a different kind of is a context in which we are asked to perform a particular kind of function. We are supposed to operate as if we're living in, this is a new normal of some kind. And I think the first place I'm going to start is that I'm going to be very clear that this is not a new normal. There's nothing normal. I don't even know what normal is, number one. I don't even know there was anything such as normal. But the claim of a new normal implies that we should be prepared, that from now on, the way that we will be engaging is within this very regulatory mode, where we get to gaze into each other's lives in a particular kind of way that does not allow us to have a sense of community and a sense of engagement that feels that we are not somehow curtailed by something larger than us, right? And it clearly means that we have to start thinking about how we want to engage with our students and how we want to do this differently to actually ensure that our students are also working in a space where they too feel and understand that learning doesn't have to be, that it doesn't have to press down on them in such an oppressive way. Because the idea of online teaching within this context of the coronavirus, where feels very oppressive, it feels very regulated, it feels very controlled in a particular way. So I am going to ensure that my students, in terms of their learning process, that it is something that is more of an engagement, that is something that provides them room to think also about what learning is in this context, that it is not just about, it's not just about consuming, the information so that you will, you will know it at the end of it. It's about really thinking about it in a way that also is of how we actually rethink sort of intellectual work, and how we attempt to figure out this particular moment as we do the work that we are doing, but to always think of it as it is in the context of the moment, but to do it in such a way that you are also learning. You're learning through a process of care in some way, care of yourself, and care of each other, and care for the person who's engaging with you, and recognizing that there is some kind of a communal kind of engagement that we have to try and create in this moment, where we are actually being positioned to become even more alienated from each other.
Go ahead, Idil. You don't get off. You're muted. You're muted, Idil.
I said, no, I don't want to get off. I'd never want to get off. I'd like the challenge. But I would like you to repeat your question.
Sure. Moving into as we begin the semester, and as a professor, as somebody who works with students, I'm interested in hearing a bit about your kind of pedagogical approach to this, thinking forward as an activist scholar, as a scholar oriented towards abolition. How do you begin this semester? How do you, what are we doing otherwise? How are we making sure that the institution's attempts to kind of push us all towards business as usual, or some random bizarre version of it, isn't just reproducing what we're trying to get away from?
Yeah. So if I'm honest, I have the privilege and complication of teaching like what we would call, well, in my former school, like an intensive course. And it is a 1-week course that now needs to be taught 1 week online. That is a 12-week course. So I'm trying to figure that out still. And I obviously have not certainly been doing this for as long as people like Bev and some of the other people who've been online and in the scholar strike. So I've certainly learned a lot from strategies and tactics from the scholars who've been here previously. So I thank them for that, as well as the students and people participating in the chats around like what makes sense, what doesn't, what's questionable, what so forth. So first and foremost, I think I want to talk about the idea of like public pedagogy and the ways that public pedagogies ultimately inform the ways in which we engage and do this work, right? But then also like I don't want to be horrible, Rosalind. I don't want to be horrible. But I want to talk about the ways truly in which COVID has not altered or will not alter, and or going online this semester will not alter the care, kindness, and generosity that I've offered to students, even when I was teaching one course online, right? Despite the rate my prof comments. But I've always approached my teaching and my pedagogy in a way that recognizes, accepts, and understands, and holds in reciprocity the experiences of students, right? And with the absolute privilege, and I want to call it a privilege and an honor, of working with an amazing set of colleagues in the School of Disability Studies, that for many people, teaching online is not new, teaching online is not a disturbance, but teaching online is a point of access, is a point of freedom, knowledge, and being able to engage. And I want to hold that, right? And while many of us talk about sort of issues of neoliberalism in access. Oh my God, this is horrible. And the students are going to email me 2,000 times a day. Yeah, like shit, I'm worried about that too, right? And I want to be clear about that. But I'm also really cognizant of ways in which students who are in rural spaces, Indigenous students, Black students, racialized students, working class students, rural students, off the grid students, finally feel like there's a way that they can meaningfully also participate in this process. So again, I ask us to sort of hold the both and with approaches, right? There are ways in which absolutely this is horrible and disgusting and like, fuck, I don't want to do it either. I don't, right? I don't want to be a bald, fat, Black Muslim woman, right? Talking about white supremacy online when a student can't come to my office and say, but Idil, what did you mean by that, right? And I also want us to remember that in the context of online, that there are particular people who will get the brunt of poor assessments online, poor engagement online. And ultimately, these are not different people from the folks who would have gotten it before, right? And even then, I want to complicate this outside of race. So I want to talk about my colleagues who may be not Black and not Indigenous and not living with a disability, that haven't had to friggin' teach online for 25 years, because when they got a job like this, what the hell is D2L? What is all these institutional systems, right? And the ways that that will also play out in terms of ageism, in terms of access, et cetera. And so I want us to think about that too, and ultimately the ways in which many folks and many students who otherwise may have figured out a way to get to our class may not, also because of the idea of teaching online, right? And so on that note, I guess when you talk about notions of violence and like what I want to think about and what I want to hold, I want to hold that on a Monday morning at 8 o'clock, I might not know that one of my students may be experiencing domestic violence in multiple ways at home, right? And that maybe being online may have me ask a different question of that student when they maybe don't post in a discussion because they only teach us like a very few ways about how we can engage students online, right? So discussion posts and all these things, right? I would have done that before anyway. Some of us would not have, right? I want to think about the ways in which I don't shame students about the ways that they figure out how they will make time for my class and or how they will manage the fucking shit that I talk and my fast speaking self and my super animated self. So if they need to mute me, that's okay. If they need to come back and visit me, if they need to smoke a joint and watch me or light their sage or listen to something in the background, right? That I'm okay with that, because I also understand that this may mean that they now get to hear, listen, and engage differently, right? Mm-hmm. And I also think about the things in which were discussed in the conversation prior, of which Lana James talked about around notions of surveillance and what that means. And my dissertation work focuses on ideas of surveillance technologies, particularly Black people and Black women, and the context of poverty and social assistance and public access, right? And so I'd also be remiss if I didn't remind people that like one of the first places that like Canada had CCTV cameras was in Sherbrooke, Quebec, which is like one of, so you researchers don't go dragging me later, but is like one of the most highly populated student environments in all of Canada. It has like, I think 8 institutions of higher education. And so that was one of the first places I had CCTV cameras downtown, because at the time, which, you know, this is one of my sort of conjectures, is that at the time when Sherbrooke put in the CCTV cameras for surveillance is also at the same time that they had an influx of North African, Algerian students, Arabized Black students, not even Arabized, I'd say Arabized Black students and Arab racialized Black African students, East African students, African students, coming on that campus. And then subsequently after, the next place that had CCTV cameras in Canada. And again, I'm thankful to like surveillance scholars prior to me, David Lyons, so many other surveillance, like non-Black Canadian surveillance scholars that do this work. But it's really interesting for me that in a place like the Four Corners in Sudbury, that at the same kind of political time and moment where Laurentian University was taking a high number of African students, that was the second site that there was CCTV cameras, right? Yep. And like, this is the this is the unsexy work, right? This is the unsexy work that it takes time to kind of both like locate, go into the archive, but then a kind of specific theorizing that makes you think about Black Canada in that moment, right? And then also in the context of me being a professor, to really think about like, what does this mean both in the context of surveillance, policing, hyper-policing, nation state, in the context of being on stolen land, and the folks that are also hyper-surveilled. Mind you, to be clear, Sudbury is like, has like a super high Indigenous population, right? So that's also not lost on me as well. And so when I think about all of those things, what does that mean in the context then of my teaching, right? Right? And then again, like I said this earlier, but what does it mean for what we would consider the most highly educated, right? Creative, critical people to not think about in a moment like this, how can we do something differently? Are we not ones who are supposed to be the vanguard of thinking, critical thoughts of social justice, right? So if the institution and the academy cannot in many ways be the vanguard and sort of forethought in critical methods of like carceral care, policing, anti-policing, abolition, who do we expect to do that work, right? And in particular, when we talk about policing sort of as if policing is outside of every other system, Rosalind, but we know that it is not, right? And we know that in the context of Black and Indigenous people, policing began at the inception of our interaction with people who were not like us, right? So from the transatlantic slave trade and so on, but ultimately here on Turtle Island, what is the relationship between policing, education, and Black people outside of higher education? And so why would we expect that when we get to the university context, that would mean something different? Yeah. Right? There's no reason why I should see Muslim students of any race praying in a hallway, right? Like there's a whole host of things, but you're saying yeah, so I think you want to talk.
I'm not, to be honest, it's time to wrap. And so like, and this has just been, this conversation has been such a beautiful way to end such a wonderful 2 days. I'm going to turn it over to the incredible Bev Bain. Bev, don't thank you. Justice, Beverly.
Thank you, Idil. You were amazing. Thank you, Rosalind. Thank you. You were amazing. I want to thank my co-organizer of the 2 days, Minsuk Lee, first of all. Amazing work, for the amazing work. I want to thank all of the presenters, all of the participants in the teach-ins. I think these 2 days clearly gave us a roadmap to rethink, to reimagine, and to move forward. I want to thank Okufa, Megan Linton, Jordan, Arthur, Rajan, Alana, the Disability Studies Department at Ryerson. I want to thank all of you for making this 2 days amazing. It's left us with so much And we could not have done this without all of you, without this particular moment really driving us. So I want to sound off by saying, in solidarity, in love, in power, liberation.
Can we also really, really quickly thank Dr. Rosalind Hampton?
I did.
Well, I'm an extra thank
you are.
I'm my own person, Bev.
Oh, sorry. Are you? Really?
Well, today, just for today, Bev. I know you're an OG, but just for today. I extra want to thank.
I love you.
Of course, I love you too. Shout out.
I love you both.
Of course, I already know that.
Big love.
Thank you. Thank
Big
you.
love.
Thank you for your kindness and your critique beyond today and always. Thank you for your Black sisterhood. Thank you for your holding up. Thank you for all your F words and fuck this and fuck that when I need it. I appreciate you. I also want to thank Professor Bev Bain, Professor Minsuk Lee, Professor Ronaldo Walcott, Professor Eve Huck, Professor Christina Sharp. I'm gonna open my email. Just want to make sure.
We might be offline by then.
well, lastly, also obviously my awesome school and my director, School of Disability Studies, all my colleagues there. And
we might be offline by then.
Well, if we're offline, well, damn. But also thank all the participants. But thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you.